Welcome to the Baruch Performing Arts Center. I'm Stacey Jackson. I'm the New York Program Director for the Screen Actors Guild Foundation. I'm so thrilled to welcome you all here for our Life Raft event, Interactive Storytelling, the Evolving Form of Video Games. Let's get down to business. I want to tell you a little bit about tonight's moderator, who came all the way from Boston to be here tonight, which I think is really special. Matthew Weise is a game designer and writer whose work spans industry, academia, and journalism. He has been a narrative designer at Harmonix Music System and the game designer director of Gambit Game Lab at MIT. His work, both creatively and critically, focuses on transmedia adaptation with an emphasis on the challenges, and I really like this, the repeated failures of adapting cinema into video games. Matthew has given lectures and workshops on the film-to-game adaptation all over the world. Here with us tonight, all the way from Boston, please welcome Matthew and the rest of our panelists.
Hello. Mine's working.
Okay, now it works. All right. Okay, thank you for coming out. I'm the moderator of this panel, and we're going to get started very quickly here. So we're going to have everybody introduce themselves, just going down the line, and then we're going to get into a few questions, which will, probably just kind of evolve and we'll follow. But then at the end, we're going to have some questions from the audience, and I understand that people have submitted many questions on cards. So we're going to try to go through some of these at the end. We'll have a half hour for that, is my understanding. So anyway, so we'll get started.
My name is Sarah Elmaleh. I'm a voiceover artist and actor here in the city. I've worked mostly on independent games, some of the most notable titles including Skulls of the Shogun and Gone Home, which isn't out yet, but I'm really very excited for. And I also write about games and talk about games and curate or among other things. I love thinking about games, and I do that as much as possible. So some of my writing has appeared at places like Killscreen or Kotaku.
I'm Chase Moritz. I'm a narrative designer at Gameloft. We make games for mobile platforms. Some of the titles I've worked on, I did the Iron Man 3 mobile game, the Amazing Spider-Man mobile game, as well as, I've worked on games like Asphalt. I helped work on the Dark Knight Rises mobile adaptation, and a variety of different freemium games for all ages. And yeah, that's it.
My name is Charles Pratt. I've been a freelance game designer and independent game designer, I guess. That's what freelancers call themselves when they don't have work. For about 7 years, and I've also taught at the NYU Game Center for about 4 years. And starting next semester, I'll be teaching their narrative strategies course.
I'm Logan Cunningham. I'm an actor here in the city, doing whatever I can. Recently, I sort of fell into voice acting in games, mostly independent, like Sarah. I've worked on a couple of games with Sarah, with Wadget, which is a small developer here in the city, Dave Gilbert, Resonance and Primordia, which Sarah was in also. And I work with the developer called Supergiant Games, which is based in San Francisco. We made a game called Bastion. It came out 2 years ago, and we're working on another called Transistor, which should be out next year.
My name is Navid Khonsari. I have a studio here in the city called Ink Stories. We're presently working on a game called 1979 about the revolution in Iran. Prior to that, I came from a film background and got into gaming by working at Rockstar Games, where I got to work on all the Grand Theft Auto games during the PS2 era. I did The Warriors, and let's see, I've gone on to do Alan Wake, and I've done a fair amount of the AAA games. Been really fortunate to work with some amazingly talented voiceover people, as well as designers, and basically the entire production team. So it's good to be here.
Okay, so I actually have a question for the audience. How many people here would say that they are relatively familiar with video games, the world of video games, the culture of video games? So, okay. Well, I mean, you could be, yeah, you could be, well, I mean, well, for example, how many people would say that they don't know very much about video games, don't really play them? Raise your hands. Okay, so a few people. So yeah, I don't want to assume that you know, absolutely everybody will kind of understand all the games and all the references and stuff like that. So one of the strange things about video games is that they're this very kind of advanced form in a sense, but they're also still in a certain sense a kind of niche thing, like the broader culture. There's a bit of a dissonance at times. So I just want to be sensitive to that as we have this discussion. So one thing I did want to hear from the panelists is kind of just whoever wants to start can start. We don't have to always go this way, but I'm wondering if people could explain kind of what they do. Each of you feel like, what do you feel is your main job and contribution to the process of games? Is kind of like, you know, you understand it, and you know, hopefully touch on whether it's you know, the narrative aspect or the acting aspect of the game. Whoever wants to start. No? Why don't you start? Yeah,
I'll start.
Yeah.
I have very much hands-on interaction actually with actors from the casting process, whether it's for voices right down to the motion capture. That is actually very much how I started the production pipeline at Rockstar, taking my film background and having worked with actors as a director and bringing it towards gaming. So that's very much, and that's actually kind of what I get hired at to do right now with a number of other companies. But at my heart, I feel like I'm basically just a narrative storyteller. I think a perfect example to kind of give everyone here, as you kind of, if you have done games, great, or if you're thinking of that you want to get it, but you want to wrap yourself around kind of what is the process. When I first started this, I met a couple of guys from Rockstar, and they asked me if I knew anything about motion capture. Obviously, I lied and said I did, and in doing so, I called one of my friends who was a motion capture director, and I asked him, and he said, "Look, Navid, just when you're in there, just pretend you're directing film." And I would say that that's probably my greatest contribution is that I very much try to eliminate the barriers or the borders that exist between what gaming or animation is and what film is. I think that in the end, the games need to be able to stand above others, and they can do that with great performances, whether it's in voice or whether it's in body. That's something, regardless if your audience is watching a movie, a TV show, or playing a game, can recognize where compromise has been made. And if you, as a director or any part of the narrative team, can get you know, third parties, which are primarily actors, to be able to fall in line and understand that it's just no different than committing yourself to the role, getting yourself there, having faith in the director, if not questioning the director at all times, but just jumping into it with both feet rather than be timid, be a bulldog. I think that you yourself will get that experience that hopefully you cherish and enjoy, which I enjoy when I get a scene right with an actor, whether it's in the theater or whether it's on a movie screen. So my main goal and my main focus is to create that beautiful hybrid of amazing storytelling within games, and a big part of what I do is relying on amazing performances from actors. So that's kind of my 2 bits.
Yeah, I'll hop in. I think what I primarily do is, since we work on such a wide variety of games across different genres, and a lot of them at once, because like the way we function, we have offices across 20 countries, and then all of the narrative demands of the games are filtered down to one team in New York City that then handles everything worldwide. So I guess what I do is I look at what style of game it is, and then try and figure out a way to make narrative complement the game mechanic, and figure out, you know, whether something needs more story, if it's, you know, a racing game or a soccer game, if it needs less story, but how to contextualize things, and then try and, you know, work with everything to give the player a sense of immersion, be it the menu screens, like how can we house that to make it fit in with sort of the basic premise of the game. How can we take some of these gameplay mechanics and really contextualize them so that they work with the narrative of the game rather than stand out. When it comes to actors, a lot of our games, especially the movie adaptations, have had voiceovers, and I've been in the booth and directed some actors. Well, not in the booth, but, you know, outside the soundproof glass, directing the actors. And it's a lot of fun, and I think, you know, what's really interesting is as the technology grows, and, you know, you mentioned mocap, I think it's going to be a lot more than the actors' voices that are going to sort of being conveyed through these games. It's going to be expressions, it's going to be a gesture, so the actor's body will really be at play, you know, in the same way they are in perhaps like, you know, some live action films. So I think it's really exciting.
So I just want to clarify the question. Is this like a philosophical question about what a voiceover artist does? I think in one degree is really clear, or should I talk about how I view it?
I think it's more just about like just describe like what your. I think any answer is going to be interesting, but what your job, you know, just like day to day, kind of like what would when you say, like, for example, like when I tell people I work in video games, you get this kind of horrible response sometimes, which is, oh, that you must play video games all day, which kind of tells you what a black box.
Which I also do, though.
Yes, but well, yes.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, but not you don't get paid for it, I think that. So it's more just to like help familiarize people with like what, like, are you in a booth? Like, is that your job, or are you doing other things as well? You know.
I haven't done. I'm looking forward to performance capture. I haven't done it yet. I think it's an interesting and a different beast, and I have sort of complicated, passionate feelings on both sides of it. Because I love being, on the one hand, I love being in a booth, which is what I normally do and have done thus far for games, is just in a booth with direction without any other part of my performance being captured. And you get a script usually that's just it's completely non-linear, and you do, it depends on the take, or on the bulk of stuff to be covered for the session. Sometimes it moves really quickly. I am assuming everyone knows how voiceover actually works. So you're in a booth, you don't have a scene partner usually, and I will do probably 3 in a row, almost without interruption until we find a stopping place. And that's sort of how it actually looks, my process thus far.
So very similar to voice work for animation. Yeah,
I think animation, it depends. I haven't done as much animation, but my understanding is that there's proportionally more sessions are done with your scene partners compared to video games. Probably other people here can clarify that, but I think it's much less uncommon to actually have other actors to act with, which, as you know, transforms your performance a great deal.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't. Most of my work has been with Supergiant, the developer I mentioned. We did that game Bastion, and the company was started by a friend of mine that I grew up with. That's how it happened. So I kind of did a guy a favor, and suddenly wound up a voice actor in a game. But the way we work is so collaborative, and we have the luxury of time, and also I know these guys, so it's like I'm just making something with friends. So it's a really kind of comfortable, luxurious kind of thing. So it doesn't feel so much like work, and it's a very piecemeal kind of process for us. We'll just do a line until it's right, until it sounds good. So I'm curious how hireable I would be in the real world.
It depends. I've had sessions like that, and I've had sessions with varying degrees of information at their fingertips for me to use. I mean, I've had some where I have no context, no art, no nothing to work with, and then others where I get to see a sort of rough build of an animatic for a scene that's really crucial to the story, and sort of other bits of context or previously recorded audio files, actually, to be fair, from other scene partner or would-be scene partners. So that, I don't know if there's so much an industry standard for those kinds of things. I think it's more up in the air maybe than in other types of voiceover, like what you have to work with and use informationally for your performance, who else is there with you, who's directing you, and what their role on the project is, all that kind of stuff. So that's like so unhelpful for more people who are like wanting to learn about how these things run. It varies.
We will get into the nitty-gritty details of this stuff as we go. So,
Well, I'm a game designer, which basically means my part of the process is the creation of the rules and game mechanics, brainstorming, testing, documentation, and especially if you're talking about a game that has environments or anything like that, you could get into level design as well, although it's not synonymous with game design. So I tend to have for any given game, the game designer has several roles, but they usually try to have a very sort of high-level abstract understanding of the game systems and how those are going to work and how those are balanced and tuned. And then on a sort of philosophical level, there are different, there are different ideas about how one should go about this, but for the most part, the game designer is very concerned about the player as the sort of central performer in the system, and how, what is the player's experience? What is the goal? What is the goal of the game? What kind of experience are they trying to provide? And really sort of shepherding that experience through the whole process and making sure that every part of the development is supporting that experience.
So it sounds like on this panel we have represented, and this is going to be, I want to say, an oversimplification, because obviously it's more complicated than this, but it sounds like people have talked about what, if you're coming from not knowing a whole lot about video games, what might sound familiar as kind of, directing actors in a more kind of like directorial role, creating scenes, working with actors to get things right, being an actor, working in a, voice recording booth, being a writer to some extent, working on stuff, and being the designer, which is also kind of like being a director. There's no direct analog there, but somebody who is sort of masterminding and whose job it is to architect a lot of these things. So
we certainly like to think of ourselves that way.
Yes, but I think that, but this is, my point is that this is kind of like this is the kind of the range, right, of expertise that we have in the panel. So one of the things that I would like to get into next, and I think we've already started talking about it, is the, what is, and I think this is, the way this question is written is a little bit loaded, because is who is most responsible for creating and guiding the story development of a game? Because it doesn't necessarily need to be one person, but I think that we have this notion of the auteur in film, certainly, right, which itself is kind of a little bit problematic, which is like, one person is like the main artist behind a work, right? So, this myth exists in the culture, and I don't want to say it's totally untrue, but obviously it's more complicated in a lot of ways. So in games, though, when we're talking about this new medium, there's a lot of disagreement in games as to how that actually works in this medium, and how, when you play a game and you like the story and you're like, that's great, like, whose hand do you shake? And I'm wondering if the panel can...
A lot of people.
Yes.
I mean, let me jump on this one. For those of you who are familiar with the process of film, I'll just break it down to you very, very, very basically. When you're shooting a film, you have a camera, you have actors, you have a background environment. Forget all that set dress. All right, we're going very, very basic, like 101 film shoot. These are the layers that you have. Now, pretend you take every aspect of that layer when it comes to making a game, and recognize that everything that you see has to be created. That character, that world, that chair, the sound in the background, everything. So as a result, there's a lot more people involved. I could do an amazing job at what I do, but if it's dependent on everyone from, what I do is an X button away from not being even viewed. So if the game isn't intriguing, so if it hasn't actually been designed properly, if it's not capturing in terms of gameplay first and foremost, then nobody's even going to care about what I do. How that sound brings that world to life is its own story. How the actors bring it to life is its own story. The level of animation, think about it. There's actually a guy that all he does is work on lighting. Because if not, it's just a black box. So every role that you have in film, from a gaffer, right down to your first AD, right down to your props person, just take that and multiply that by 5. And recognize that and the difference is that when you make a film, you've got a 3, maybe 6-month window to do the shoot and so forth. When you make a game, you're actually building a company that's going to function for, hopefully, and I'm talking on the larger end scale of the AAA games. You're talking about actually employing a group of people, 100 plus, for over 2 years. And they are all intimately involved, all are very caring about it, and it's just a much bigger beast. Just because of what they're creating is nothing that you can actually capture. It has to be created one by one, each dot by itself. So just to give you a good balance of it, I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind.
So it might be interesting if we actually got some just sort of stories from people as to games you've worked on and how the stories came together, just from your perspective, from whatever perspective you were in on the project. So like in Bastion, for example, like it would be interesting to just hear about, from your perspective, how that came to, like, who seemed to be the author and masterminding that? Was it one person? Was it several people? Like, how did that work?
So, Supergiant, the way they work is it's always gameplay first. There might be some high-level idea of what the world might be or the story might be, but the game comes first, and then it's the writing kind of fills that in. And with Bastion, I got involved pretty early, but I didn't know like the plot of the game. I didn't know. I knew who I was playing, and that he was like this character that was narrating this story, that this was going to be a narrated experience, and that it was going to go on and on. You know, that I was sort of going to be like an actor on tap for them. They could just come to me whenever they had lines ready. And there was like a big world, game world document and all this detail and background of the character and background of the world, which I didn't see until I'd been doing it for about 6 months. So I wish I'd seen it before, but yeah, it's completely, there isn't, at least in our case, at Supergiant, there isn't one creator. I mean,
can I ask you a question? Did they make that, like you said you saw it 6 months later, do you think that your influence and your involvement and the tone of your voice and your performance actually helped them create that character?
It did, yeah. Yeah, it was sort of like rough sketches at first, and then it sort of filled in the more and more that I did. But I mean, the story and the writing of it is the work of one person. That's his name's Greg Kasavin, who's like a longtime industry veteran. He used to be a games journalist, and then he went to the development side, and now he's credited as creative director at Supergiant. And yet, every creative decision we make, from the design of an enemy to music, to just a lot of stuff, just all the assets that go into the game, goes through all of us. The title of the game, we just sort of have long, heated Skype calls about, and just fight about stuff all the time, but about like the right things. So there's no one person in charge. We have a studio director, Amir Rao, who's my childhood friend who got me involved, but that's just because we had to have one. So everybody wears like a lot of hats. And there are these shows called PAX, the Penny Arcade Expo, which is like it's like a Comic-Con for games, sort of a big convention thing. There's one in Boston, there's one in Seattle. I think there's a new one in Australia or something. Anyway, so we go to these game shows, and I go with them to help like kind of man the booth. So it does go a little bit beyond just recording lines into a vacuum. For me, anyway. But,
yeah, I was going to say, you seem to have a really unique, as a resident voiceover artist,
yeah.
you have a really unique, collaborative, close relationship with everyone else on the team, which I would love to, maybe not to derail this question, but hear more about eventually. Because it's an exciting direction, I think.
I don't think you're derailing the question, because one thing that struck me about so from what you're describing, I get the impression that as an actor, you were in conversations about what a character should look like, how something should sound, what maybe you should be able to do in the game at this point or that point. Is that correct?
Partially. Not all that stuff. Like the design of the character I didn't have anything really to do with that.
But you were in conversation. I mean, it's not like they were like, we got to change the character, and they would call you before they did anything. But it was,
no.
But you were in, they weren't just like, let us handle that, we'll call you when we need your voice. Like
no.
Yeah,
okay. It's different.
Okay.
Which I've seen, yeah.
Yeah, no, but this is what I wanted to get into, like so that's one kind of experience that is, I don't want to give the impression that it's totally unusual, because it does happen. There are some very organic companies, but this is also plenty of cases where this does not happen, right? So, and I don't know,
we'll call it unique.
Yes. But you started to say something about that, so I didn't know.
I don't remember what it was. But I think that, I mean, I'm excited by it. As an actor who does care deeply about the medium on a whole and beyond, without trying to step on anyone's toes, and with great respect for the specializations in the craft of game making, but someone who thinks about the game on a larger, beyond my own role in it, and how my role, what role I play in the larger picture, I find that to be an exciting development. And I think there's still a line there, talking to actors who I think have the luxury of working, thinking of Naughty Dog specifically, has a very actor collaborative atmosphere, and they still draw the line of like, oh, I let the geniuses do all the level design, and so they should. But as far as touching other parts of the process, But they are, I think, among some of the most collaborative long-term. Again, my character develops because we have table reads and rehearsals and collaboration and improv over a long period of time. So yeah, just thinking about
for
that.
those of you who don't know, Naughty Dog did Uncharted, which is famous as very much. I mean, people say it's kind of inspired by Indiana Jones. It's actually more like Romance in the Stone, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, it's famous for being this kind of well-written, well-acted level of quality in games. But I know that they gave a talk. That they're famous for actually having actors together when they actually do recordings and actually having readings and doing improvisations and then capturing the improvisations and then rewriting the script and stuff like that. And
well, I mean, so Naughty Dog's based out of LA in Hollywood, and what they've actually done is they've taken the film model of how you prepare for a film and adapted it to games. So extremely crucial is, like, I was listening to you guys. I'm like, when I'm working with actors, I get a script, but if it's not sounding good through the read-through, or when we're doing rehearsals, or we're doing blocking and it's not fitting, or even in voiceover stuff, there's got to be some flexibility to be able to give it to that person who's performing it to kind of own it. So I think now what you're seeing is kind of an understanding to be able to tell a good story. You need to have good performance. Having good performance doesn't mean you just get somebody that's got a really great voice and throw them into a VO booth and just try to bang it out.
Yeah, I mean,
it is about rehearsals. It's about getting feedback. It is about that, and that's hopefully what it's maturing to. But you also have to understand that just because it's called a video game and it gets lumped into this thing called entertainment, it doesn't mean that the people that come from that background necessarily see entertainment in the same way as multiple partners that are involved in theater, plays, or movies, TVs, or whatever, because they're all different beasts. Just one quick example, and I'm just going to be quiet for a while. You look at a lot of Hollywood film actors, and what they're actually known for is like their subtlety in front of the camera. It's almost like what we as audiences take in by being able to look into Brad Pitt's eyes, let's say in the movie Seven, when he discovers something horrible. It's not about an exaggerated scream. It's not, although he did that later. But I mean, it's more about, that's what you kind of get. In games, if you actually looked at an animated character and looked straight into their eyes, you see nothing. I mean, that's where it separates the reason that animation has that slight bit is that no matter how realistic we make things look, you still realize that there's just something lacking there behind those eyes. So the ability for other aspects of it to become richer and have to be stronger is you need that subtlety to a certain degree, but you also need to make it a performance. You don't have the luxury of having somebody stand there and just look in the camera, and for us as an audience to come to conclusions. You do need to kind of gear them a bit there. You need that subtlety, but you just need that little bit of extra because you're dealing with things that people just subconsciously recognize as animation and possibly not a real character, no matter how realistic it looks.
Yeah, I think video game voiceover is in a unique part of the spectrum of because it's not oftentimes, and there are certainly cartoony games, but video game voiceover is largely more naturalistic than, say, a highly stylized animated cartoon, but it does carry more of that burden in your voice, as with all voiceover, of communicating something where you don't have everything else to recruit for meaning and intention and all of that other stuff. So I think that finding that sweet spot of something that's very human and natural, which I think is what many games call for, but remains heightened enough and focused enough through your voice makes it a specialty. The other thing I think about having this sort of the trends in rehearsal process and actor process to remember is that games are so diverse and so different, and their workload and their process is so different that I have great sympathy for games that can't meet that same level of collaborativeness and all that time and all that money in rehearsal, because Uncharted is a very linear game. I hope that makes sense to most people. It moves from beginning to end without a great deal of variation story-wise. Whereas other games, just to cite an example, BioWare, I think cares as much about performance and utilizes performance. Performance is just as important to the game. Character is just as important to the game, but it's so massive and involves so many people and so many variations that they can't have scheduling, for scheduling reasons, money reasons, getting everyone into they just can't accommodate that same process. So for me, what I hope is that people will start to understand what the ideal actor performance process is, and then feel emboldened and not defeated by the prospect of taking bits of it that will work for them for their game, and customizing something that allows them to get the most out of their actors while also making sense for the rest of their development process.
Yeah, I mean, actors I feel they're always best when they're not treated like a contractor. Like when the actors aren't treated like plumbers or something, it's just like, here we go, we got like 2 hours, we gotta get through these lines, go, just do it. So it's nice, and you don't always have it, you usually don't, but it's good to have that kind of collaboration and that sort of just that space. Because, you know, voice acting in games is notoriously bad for years and years. It's getting better, I think. But I think the main reason is because it was rushed, or they weren't actual actors doing it. And so if you simply give an actor time, and if you just really just work with them, don't simply get them in and put a microphone in front of them, it's so much better.
I think there's a balance of understanding how much information you can, and with games being very secretive in their process too, like what you can share with an actor becomes, you know, tricky. But knowing how much information is really helpful, what information the actor doesn't maybe need as far as seeing levels, seeing things, talking to hearing from writers, what you can, finding that sweet spot of, you know, they don't necessarily need to take home a whole build of a game, but finding really important, crucial things that inform their performance that's like important, understanding a relationship with another character, things like that, that you can share with your actor that will help them, help you get the most out of them. And so I think there's a learning process for other people in games as far as what those things are, those sort of precision strike information bits that an actor can make the most use out of.
If you are an actor and you want to work in games, and if you don't know games, it's your fault that you didn't get that role. Fact. If you want to get into movies and you haven't seen a movie, guess what? So I understand that for many people, and you don't have to go buy the game. Just go YouTube, you can check out cutscenes, you can check out the feel for it. But
games are hard.
Yeah. But it's a reality. It's something that employs many actors, and to say, like, I've worked with, you know, high-end Hollywood actors who've come in and said that they don't know anything about games, and we're talking six-figure salaries, and I've basically been showing them the door and saying, like, look, if you come in, how dare you come into a place where we're trying to be professionals? I've cast you for this role, and you tell me you've never played a game since Pong. Like, that's just unacceptable. And so if we've got 200 people who are spending 2 years and are treating this like as a craft, we expect the people that we cast for these roles to be just as respectful and to be able to understand the process. So just like you would, you know, how many times have I done casting and somebody's come in trying to dress like that performance, like that, what that role calls for? This is just an extension of the same thing. So understanding that there are technological barriers out there, it's over. If you got a phone, it's over. You should know this, and that's a fact. So I highly recommend that with the use of YouTube and what's out there, that every person, that if you're going to go read for something, you need to know the material. You need to understand, because just because it's animated doesn't mean you go in there and you act like Ren and Stimpy or like a crazy little animated character. They will be looking for that certain subtlety. They will be looking to see how you're going to read off of other people.
And and again, now that it'll be my turn to shut up for a while, but because I often go around, I'm like, oh, because I love games and I play them, and I'm like, yeah, you should play games, you should know what you're talking about. And then I see poor people who are super friends, who are like super interested in games as a medium, and it's hard, and I have to remember that it's hard, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's hard. And actors who've been in games and want to assess their own performance can't, and it's like, maybe it's Grand Theft Auto, and it's like, they can't even get there. So it's like, it's hard. So, but yes, YouTube is there, and there's a whole category of videos called Let's Play, which I guess now there's a whole controversy. So as long as we have Let's Play, go watch a lot of videos they're called Let's Plays, and just people will play a game and make a YouTube video of it, usually talk about it and be ridiculous and funny, but you get a chance to I didn't have a PlayStation 3, I watched all of Uncharted, the first one, in a Let's Play that's like 10 hours. But I was curious about what they were doing with the form, and I watched it all, and so that's a great way to have someone else walk you through, but get a sense of the whole experience and where your performance slots into it.
I was just wondering from the folks who didn't talk if there was anything you wanted to add, or if not, that's fine. We can go to the next thing.
What was the original question?
The original question was about, we kind of segued from talking about authorship to kind of Let's Plays. So I think that yeah, but just like the kind of creative authorship aspect of the game in terms of the games that you've worked on, like how that comes about. And
Sure. I mean, I think the mobile market's interesting because it's on a very tight schedule, and so you know, there's a lot of voices. But one of the most interesting things I've found is the jar size can limit what kind of story you can have. There was this game I was working on, and I designed a fat cop character, and I wrote a bunch for him, and I loved him, and I was really excited about him, and then I got told, like, oh, it'll take somebody 6 weeks to make the fat cop model, and we can't have him. And you know, it hurt me deeply, creatively, but but you know, it's just about working with what the game can do, what the game has. I've worked on a lot of licensed properties, and I think when doing that, the licensor has a big hand in what your final story is. And that's, you know, it's their intellectual property, I understand that, but there can be a lot of back and forth over what you think works with the game context versus what they think works with the character, and it's about, you know, trying to come to that happy medium. But I find generally what I do on a lot of smaller games is I'll get what the style of game is, whether it's a racing game, sports game, adventure game, whatever. I'll usually pitch 3 or 4 different small story snippets to the producer, and then the producer will usually hone in on a couple that sound good to them, and we take those to the team and see what we can do with assets, and it sort of comes from there. So it really is a collaborative scene.
Yeah, I guess if I was going to add anything, I'm glad someone else said it, but I completely agree. You should play video games if you want to do what. For the totally pragmatic reason that, you know, like Sarah said, there's a lot, like video games, like come in a lot of different forms, a lot of different forms. They're sort of morphologically far more variety than, I would say, your typical feature film, right? And I think that if you're a voice actor and you want to work in this medium, or if you're a mocap actor or anything, like understanding what type of game you're going to be doing that work for is going to help you understand, really kind of help you guess what the process is going to be, right? Like if you're doing a game like Uncharted, which is thought of as sort of like a very linear action game, right? That is going to have maybe room for more rehearsal. That's right, because they have planned that game out beat by beat all the way through. If you're working on something that's much more systemic, like an RPG, or even sort of like a sim like GTA, although GTA has a lot of resources to kind of overcome this, you have to understand that like your work is going to be there's going to be a lot of trade-off the resources that company can spend on the work on actors with, you know, just testing things more often, right? The more systemic a game is, there's a lot more things that can go wrong with it, and so there are a lot more of those resources are sucked in. And there's a lot more that like things will just change about the game over the course of development, so they don't even know really what the story beats are. They don't know if this character is even going to be in, right, past a certain amount of time, right? Like it's just a much more tumultuous process. So playing games, understanding the different forms that they take, if you get a job, that's going to help you understand like the context in which your work is being received, and maybe help with the preparation a little bit.
And I think one of the frustrating things for actors that I've seen is a lot of times what people perceive to be bad voice acting isn't even necessarily the actor's fault. You know, I've watched Let's Plays where it was the sound design that left a little too long between lines. So somebody would call someone on the radio and be like, beat, beat, beat. Okay, I'll send him. And it's like, oh, the guy throw away, like, oh, what terrible voice acting. It's like, but that's not really the case. There are a lot of other factors at work here. So, you know, I think one of the things that delineates voice acting for games a lot more than something on stage or something on screen is you are not with a partner. So if they place your line wrong, if it's recorded not great, like you don't have a lot of control over that. And it can be, you know, in some games I've played a real crapshoot. So I think it takes some bravery to really get in there and expect that they're going to treat you right, especially with some of the examples in game voice acting.
I know different people with different tactics for trying to arm themselves against those. I know one voice actor who I admire greatly and is a champion and doesn't play games, interestingly enough, but Jennifer Hale will ask who her scene partner is, not in the context of the game, but she'll actually just ask who the other actor is. And she's worked enough and with enough of these different people that that's to her the most important piece of information that she can use to help figure out how to deliver her next set of lines. But yeah, no, I had a funny experience where like someone used, we did a bunch of laughs, and he used one and repeated it like a couple times in the conversation, and I was like, oh God, it was really, I gave you so many. But it comes down to maybe a resource thing. Maybe there wasn't room in there space-wise for more than one laugh. You know, you never know what that decision was based on.
Something totally pragmatic. This is like as a game player, not as a game developer, and I don't know how possible this always will be, but ask what the person you're playing looks like. Like they're like, honestly, I know very little about voice acting, but like the one thing I notice as a player often is that voices don't look like they're coming out of the people that have been modeled. So just like ask, I don't know if it's possible, like maybe they won't have the model yet, maybe they don't have the character really pinned down, but just ask what that person looks like, and that you will have probably a better idea what that person should sound like than maybe the game designer or the concept artist or someone like that.
I mean, I think on that, one thing I found interesting about game writing, and that a lot of, I mean, I didn't think of it when coming in, but it's barks that are really important, and I'd say almost as important as the main scene, because, so for those who don't know, like a bark is when you're in level, like you hit somebody and they make a sound, or you pass something and somebody says something, or it's the little mini character reactions to each other in a game, like during gameplay.
Would you say that it's like if you get punched, it's having to go like, ugh,
yeah,
or
you know, there were moments in Spider-Man games
hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, where if Spidey's like swinging for so long, he'll say something like, "Oh, beautiful sunny day," or just like if you're paused, but whatever. But you hear these over and over and over again, whereas these scenes you'll see once or twice, and man, like.
They're 90% of what the player experiences as far as your voice
so
acting.
if you write an annoying bark, that player's going to hear that thing like dozens of times. So I came into it thinking like, okay, these scenes are the most important part. Like, you know, some of these barks I can take time, but then you play it and you're like, geez, I really should have, you know. So you live and you learn, but barks are very important.
They're also, I think they're also among the more specialized elements of video game voiceover that doesn't necessarily carry over from other kinds of performance and acting. And every time I have a session and I've done more adventure games which have fewer barks traditionally because they're more conversations and less combat. But every time I do them, I learn something new. Like I learned that I have more variety in me for getting hit than hitting people. And I was like, I don't know what that says about me, but that's something now that I need to know. I need to pay more attention to aggressive noises than like, ow, you know, like that's a terrible example. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's like the biggest thing that a new video game voice actor, one things to be top of mind and to be aware of as a new separate thing is barks and exertions. And the other thing to remember is that oftentimes that information is or rather that line is coded with information beyond whatever your sort of story motivation. You're like, oh, this line is about, you know, my relationship with my father, and it's like, he's over there, and you're like, no, this is just important information, especially in a systemic game for the player, and knowing how to lift or billboard, whatever you want to say, understanding the functional use of some of that dialogue and respecting it is important as well.
Also, I was gonna just so I know, you said exertions, barks, and exertions. I just want to get my terminology correct. So
barks.
I think what I was doing before, those were exertions.
Yes, exertions are the things
like
that sound like.
There's barks. There's like throwaway
There's
lines.
also efforts.
Yeah.
I've heard them also called efforts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think that those things are also can be really. It's interesting that depending on the people you're working with, you might not have a narrative designer or whoever's in charge. Who thinks this way, but hopefully you do, that those exertions and all those lines are part of the same characterization and the same kind of psychological preparation, right? Because if you have a platformer where you're running around and jumping, are you a desperate character? Like, is this easy for the character? There can be characterization in all those little things as well. Okay, so we will probably come back to this, just general talking about voice acting at some point. We've covered a chunk of it, and I wanted to, I feel like this might make sense as a segue into, we've mentioned some specific games, and for perhaps some of the people in the audience who don't know as much, like, I would like people to talk about, for a bit, just kind of like where we are today in terms of narrative in video games, as like what are the kinds of games that tend to have narrative and storytelling as like a main selling point. Like what are the, like you mentioned combat as being like a common thing, right? Like combat's in a lot of games. Some narrative heavy games have combat. Some games with combat don't have narrative at all. Some games, like we've mentioned adventure games a few times, or RPGs, tend to be very dialogue focused, right? And there's other kind of games that are narrative focused, but they don't have a lot of dialogue. So I'm just wondering if, I don't know if again we want to just kind of like go down the line or what, but I'd like to hear from the panel like what you guys, how you see the kind of main narrative genres, I suppose, and like what are the kind of main ones right now? I mean, like I guess just to throw one out, do you think RPGs is like the main one, or?
Well, it's funny, right? Because I was thinking about this. I would actually say, as far as people who are doing experiments with storytelling, but also acted storytelling, right? Either through voiceover. I think that's really adventure games. What's strange about RPGs is that it's kind of a mixed bag. Some of them are very story-driven. Sorry, role-playing games. Some of them, all of them are very story-driven, but some of them are more sort of AV focused than others, right? Some are like very text-focused, so there's not much acted story in them.
There's a lot of story, but no voice acting.
But no voice acting, yeah. No necessarily like performance. So I actually think that things like Heavy Rain and The Walking Dead, like that's where a lot of the action is right now. I don't know if it'll stay that way, but
which are kind of like, for people who don't know, are kind of, those games have been called by some the kind of modern evolutionary equivalent of what in years past was called an adventure game. And some people use the term adventure game now still, but adventure games were these games in the 80s and 90s where you would kind of click around with a mouse cursor and then your character would walk up and pick up an item and talk and stuff. And then, I don't know, how many of you have played Heavy Rain in the audience or heard of it? It's kind of what is, for lack of a better term, an interactive movie. Yeah. And people have said the same thing about The Walking Dead as well.
How many of you have played Myst? Yeah. Maybe a better touch point.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's an adventure game. Myst, it's an adventure game.
I mean, personally, I just feel like genres are starting to bleed together so much that it's all very exciting. You know, like, you take Fallout New Vegas, that has, if I'm not mistaken, last time I checked, the most recorded VO dialogue of any game that's ever been made, and I wouldn't describe it as an adventure game. There are certain text elements, but there's combat elements. You kind of create your own character. You know, same with Uncharted. The story's very exciting there, but it's more of a straight action game. So I think we're to the point where there's narrative demands in all games, regardless of what sort of game it is. And I think that the industry in the last 5-10 years has really sort of embraced narrative as something that's not unusual in games, because you look at things like Pong, you look at things like Tetris, you look at things like even Mario to a certain extent, although that had like some narrative trappings. Like the narrative's very basic, it's an afterthought compared to the gameplay, but I think more and more every game you see really takes it into consideration, like what can narrative do for this game. So I think in terms of narrative in video games, it's never been more exciting.
Well, I'm very, very excited about the way narrative is actually going. That's basically the foundation of what I'm doing right now with my own personal project and where I'm taking my company. So I'm always looking to collaborate with great actors. I think on the same front, the great thing is that mobile has seen this massive, massive boom over the past 2 or 3 years. And the fact is that barks and all these things are absolutely relevant to creating that environment and to directing you, whether you're playing on the subway or whether you're playing on your console at home. So I think that what we're seeing is what I refer to as the middle class of gaming is unfortunately over. So anybody who was making AAA games and was not going to the level of an Uncharted or going to the level of a Grand Theft Auto is now basically no longer in existence. We've seen a huge boom in the mobile game. We've seen guys like Telltale who really have done a phenomenal job on focusing on narrative and being really good storytellers. And while some people would say that's an adventure game, that's almost creating its own little hybrid of game and motion comics and is really feeling more of like truly digital interactive storytelling. And in the past, I think it's kind of fallen, maybe in the past it hasn't been as successful because of how we interact with it. I certainly think the rise of tablets and tablet sales and how everybody, you don't have to be a gamer to be able to play these. It's opening up larger demographics, and so I think it's really an amazing time right now for people who want to be storytellers, for people who want to be adventurous within gaming. You've still got your big blockbusters that are going to continue to grow, they're going to continue to do well, and they're going to become bigger and bigger, which means larger casts. But what you're also seeing is small groups of people being able to put out games, and if the content requires it, they are going to need voice support, they're going to need performance support, and then everything in the middle, such as The Walking Dead and My Game 1979. These are all focuses where just to tell you a personal story, I reached out to a couple of Iranian Americans because I wanted to be authentic to the performance, and reached out to Navid Negahban, who is Abu Nasir in Homeland, and a couple of guys from Argo. And these guys were more than eager to kind of jump on board. And Navid had done a fair amount of, it's weird referring to another guy who's named Navid when my name is Navid, but that's another, especially because it's a rare name. But like Navid, for example, had done some massive Microsoft games. And when it came to this, I felt like I was going to have a bit of a stumbling block, maybe dealing with his agent, and he was just so excited about this new template, this new way that he said, look, you tell me where, I'll show up at the studio, I'll record it, don't even worry about it. I want this to get off the ground because I feel like this is a really good path to kind of take. As was another guy, Farshad Farhat, who was in Argo. I don't know if he was the very aggressive soldier at the end at the airport. And, he was just known for that role of speaking Farsi. Meanwhile, the guy is fully fluent in English and a phenomenal actor and has now the ability to kind of like expand and go beyond not only playing that role or how certain races are like, play terrorist number 1 or terrorist number 6. He actually gets to spread his acting chops, and I think that we're going to see content across the board have that narrative focus. The big boys are still going to be there. The growth of mobile is going to be phenomenal, and it's going to continue to grow and provide opportunities. So I'm actually very, very excited, and I think it's a great time for performance across the board.
I think that adventure as a genre is becoming a really complicated term. Games are traditionally organized by the mechanic that you use to engage with them, and adventure used to mean you could say point and click adventure, and like Matt was saying, like you point at something and you click on it and you talk about it or collect it or whatever, and you'd have sort of puzzles and that shaped your movement through an environment and through a story, and that was how we understand it. But now you're seeing adventure games that don't have that same model of puzzles in them, or they or they branch more. The story changes depending on your actions, and you have sort of a role-playing hybrid, like you're saying, the hybridization, and there's like more games. Those kinds of games can be more mechanically challenging than they were before. They can be less mechanically challenging than they were before, and I think that calling things adventure is becoming this really cool, big umbrella for, and it's being employed because it has this history with story, maybe, if that's the connection. But it's like saying what an adventure game is like calling back on this feeling that you had playing an adventure game more than like a specific mechanic, and I think that makes it a really games-wise interesting space.
And I was just going to say, and also episodics, right? Like that's the other aspect that we should kind of be talking about. The Walking Dead did very successfully, which is, they provide you with one, and you actually are so engrossed within the story and the characters that they're providing you with that second, third, fourth, and fifth episode. And now they're actually very much following the TV template, which is they're going to be introducing, I believe, sometime in the fall, or maybe I'm wrong, summer, season number 2. So it's changing, and it's really kind of that particular genre is very much focusing on telling good stories.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that about maybe 7 or 8 years ago in kind of the mainstream games industry, there was this saying that adventure games died in the 90s. And it's interesting because it's a very broad genre, right? And of course, like a decade ago, it was kind of the rise of what we would today consider like the big AAA hardcore games, right? Like Halo, Call of Duty, and all this stuff was springing up. But with the rise of tablets and the diversification of gaming platforms now, which of course have a much lower barrier to entry in terms of like technological literacy and just like they're just easier to use. And expense, they're just easier to use. There is actually this rebirth of people are kind of calling it adventure, kind of for lack of a better word, but really it's just games that are about stories, where engaging with the story is the main point of the game. It's not this other thing that you're also kind of doing, right? And it's something that I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about accessibility when it comes to stuff like that, because there's a lot of cases where you might have, when we talk about hybrids, right, sometimes the part in the hybrid that is like a more kind of traditional hardcore video game with shooting is the part that prevents an audience with connecting to the narrative content. And this is something that games have been trying to address, like Mass Effect recently had this thing where they had the mode that just makes combat, it doesn't take away combat, but it essentially makes combat trivial. So you can just go, it's almost like you can skip directly to the kind of story-heavy elements. And I'm wondering if that is something that people have thoughts on in terms of, I mean, like, do we just like throw away combat in games like this, or? Because like The Walking Dead has like guns in it, but it doesn't have combat mechanics, and this is a hugely popular game.
Well, it's really, I mean, this is a really complicated history, right? And I think at least from my perspective, it's too hard to tell yet. Like, so if you think about you know, accepting sort of the computer games, which obviously have always existed, but if you talk about the arcades were also extremely like accessible, right? Like they had a very high level of accessibility, and over time what happened was that the people who played those games demanded more difficulty, right? Because they became familiar with the tropes and the mechanics of those very simple games. And so I'm hesitant, right? Like what you're absolutely right. Like we've seen a sort of resurgence of whether we want to call them adventure games or not, but those, like from a game design perspective, those are not mechanicless, right? Like they're sort of story, they're certainly story focused. But you know, it's worth remembering that a lot of genres that we now think of as extremely baroque and extremely specific, because they are, started as things that were extremely accessible, right? That's kind of how they burst onto the scene, right? Myst was thought of as this extremely accessible adventure game, right? And that's why it was enormously successful as a video game just in general, right? It's still one of the most successful adventure games ever made, certainly by name recognition alone. And yet it too sort of inexorably got more and more and more complicated, right? As its players became more and more familiar. So I mean, I'd love to hear what other people say, but my feeling is that it's in 5 years, is The Walking Dead going to be just as complicated as is in a different direction, because its player base or its audience is going to get used to those tropes, those mechanics that are there, and demand more complexity and, you know, more branching storylines, and, you know, just sort of is it going to explode out again? But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a really interesting point, because one of the reasons I think Walking Dead did so well is because we weren't used to seeing that mechanic a lot anymore, and so it was kind of, you know, a throwback to the days of yore, and sort of a breath of fresh air and everything. But you know, I mean, you take a look at like something like Angry Birds. That game has very little narrative, and it was, you know, it spawned an empire. But now, how many people want to go and play? Man. Yeah, how many people want to go and play a new? But how many then physics puzzlers like flooded the App Store after that? And you know, how many people are checking them out? So you already see the market turning away then from making new ones of those. So I think, you know, everything has a process, and there will be a lot of things that come to the market because of how successful one thing was, and then the market will become saturated with that, and it'll move on to something, the next big thing. And it's sort of like a swinging pendulum in my mind.
I think what's interesting, in particular using The Walking Dead or just adventure games, is that you as the player get to interact and make these critical decisions, and that would actually have no value if it's not a good story that you feel like you're involved with. So that's actually a huge barrier that I think a lot of people overlook, is that if you don't have a story that resonates with the audience, it doesn't really make a difference what are the critical choices. Like if I didn't care about the people that were in my party because there's a threat of zombies, and I'm kind of in this post-apocalyptic world, and I've got, you know, my own backstory. Like, if that's not engaging enough, if that's not rich enough, then I'm already out of it. So, but in regards to, I think, your point, I also feel like while many people will miss because it's a huge assumption that everyone's a good storyteller, I think it's the natural growth that we're going to see within this area where it's going to have to get more complicated. I mean, I love playing The Walking Dead. I gave the tablet to my wife, and she doesn't play games at all. And she kind of was like, well, I like the decision making, but like hitting that zombie just with like a finger on the button wasn't as, you know, as captivating as I find the dialogue. So I think that's just a matter of like just people kind of catching up what the demand is from the audience in terms of true interaction. And then we could also see it go the other way as well, which is going to be like, I don't even want to do that. You know, I want it just to be straight, just me in the story, in these cinematic moments, making these hard decisions and moving on. I don't need to, I already know that there's a threat out there. So, and the story, like now that's a large story. We can start seeing things become very, very small about two guys in a room, you know, and that's it. So I think it's going to evolve. I think it's going to grow. I think it's going to really, really get much more dense. But that seems to be like the nature of how games have kind of gone. And I would agree with you. I think that while it doesn't have the traditional mechanic that everybody looks for, which is like you should punch, is this a stealth game, you know, is this a shooter or whatever, I think it's defining itself, and the mechanic working on a critical decision-making game and being a piss-poor designer, because I'm not. I'm amazed at how difficult it is. So trying to nail down that mechanic is quite the challenge. And I think, you know, that combined with narrative story is great. And then where it's going to go and how people are going to interact with it. You know, we haven't even talked about how we start. Like the one thing which I think is extremely fascinating about The Walking Dead is these analytics at the end of the chapter, where you get to actually figure out how many other people made the same decisions as you did. And that's not even a game mechanic, you know. That's just, but it's mind-boggling. You'll find, oh wow, most of the people chosen me here. Wow, I'm a real dirtbag. I can't believe I did that. You know, like all these things kind of come about, and it's really, and just feedback. You know, that's something that doesn't rarely happen in games, which is when you make a decision, the character will be like, Jimmy will remember this. You're like, oh fuck. Meanwhile, it's nothing. It's just the subtitle. You have like, I have no understanding.
Yeah, that's the funniest thing about The Walking Dead to me is that it's talked about, and rightfully so, as this very story-focused game, and yet it more than most story games lets you in on what's happening in the system when you make these choices, right? Like it's really kind of at moments will just foreground, oh, this person likes you less, like straight up, their arrow went down, right? And it's like, oh, that's interesting, because there are a lot of, like, you talk about Uncharted, and it has no system underneath its narrative, and if it does at all, it would probably try to hide it as much as possible. So yeah, and so it's interesting that they made that decision, and it doesn't feel forced, and it feels natural. And also, though, makes me wonder if that's the hook. Like, that's the thing that's like, oh, well, I made this decision, no one else, well, I'm going to play it again. Well, oh, now I'm understanding the system. I really hope the next one has more complicated and interesting choices. And then it's just, yeah, right, like, now you're losing all of that accessibility that had at first, but I don't know.
Well, I think one of the, especially with the combat, just to go back a step, but I think that what's really interesting there is this sort of inverted relationship between the combat and the story, where story in other games might be you have story and it's going to motivate you through the combat, or you're going to have reasons to fight people now and care about the outcome. And to me, the combat instances in Walking Dead are more about filling the rest of the story with dread that you're going to have to deal with this. So it's kind of like they've switched places a little bit. And so I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out and is balanced in other games. And the other thing about difficulty is that now we're just sort of seeing different kinds, there's different difficulty. I mean, adventure games were almost never, the difficulty never lay in a twitch reflex response. So it's a different kind of accessibility altogether. It's people who like a hard brain puzzle, and the way that became really Baroque was you had totally stylized logic that made almost no sense, where some of the solutions seemed totally whimsical and frustrating, and that was its own kind of like advanced crustification.
Baroque can also be a code word for just bad design.
yeah, right. Wait, and we're sort of the question of, the question of what's good game design is a whole other thing. But so what'll be interesting then is to see if there's a new direction of difficulty that's not about complicated object puzzles, and it's not about twitch reflex gaming and interaction, but it's more about moral quandaries that are just subtle and complicated enough to make some of those Walking Dead style choices be the crux of the difficulty for the player. I don't know.
I've got, so we have, I think got about 40 minutes left, is that correct? Yes? So we're going to try to leave, well, I can't see anything because of the lights. But, so I would like to go over some more, I think we actually covered quite a lot of stuff. We went over most of the stuff that I have in my questions here, but I do want to go over some of the acting questions again before getting into the questions from the audience. One of the questions here is, one of the questions I have here is a question about hours, just like when you're acting. It's like how much time do you actually spend? And I know that, for example, on Bastion, it sounds like there's like much more involvement, but for some people you might just walk in, and I'm wondering like what the differences are there. Yeah, like what are the,
Yeah, it varies. I mean, I think, well, a lot of it has to do actually with union contracts, which someone else can probably speak much, much better to. But your basic set there would be 4 hours up to 3 voices at a time. Someone should correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's true. 4 hours and up to 3 voices in that session. And that will dictate that the sort of the ripples of that throughout the rest of the process, I think, are interesting, or would be interesting to look at, because, you know, how are you differentiating your performance for 3 different people? There's like a thing of getting bang for your buck, so there's like an incentive to get the most out of your session hours. And then, you know, those, depending on how much you have to get through, again, will change the session flow. So if you might be going with almost no direction until you hit a stopping point and you're like, any notes? Or you might go work something if you have the luxury of time, much more casually and have time to talk through all kinds of things. And then that's affected also by the type of game, and you know, your workload is affected by the type of game if there's a lot to cover. So there's all these different variables, but the sort of union contract structure, I think, would be an interesting thing to sort of do a different symposium on, and how it affects games and performance in games. But I think 2 hours tends to be more of a productive, by 4 can be pretty strenuous also, depending on the type of game, and if you're doing a lot of efforts in screaming, saving those till the end is a good business practice. Not to tell people the business, but so yeah. And then how many pickups you do, how many different sessions that's spread over, depends also on the size of your role and the type of game. As well. So again, I'm doing another it varies answer.
Oh yeah, of course it does.
Yeah. Anything to add?
No, not really. I mean, sure. Yeah, Bastion, we just did it until it was good. So there was never until I couldn't speak anymore, and then we'd call it a day. But I think I haven't heard of, like, in the industry, like a session going more than, I think, 4 hours. Yeah. I think. Yeah.
There are barks. It's a part of the unfortunate role of a voiceover actor, and definitely save them to the end, and don't really plan on doing another session after that. These are just straight up truths, because we want to get the right performance. If somebody's supposed to be scared, they're supposed to scream, and you're not going to be able to really jump after that after a 3-hour session. And, you know, while I sit here and I kind of talk about the creative process and what I'd like to, you know, how I like to kind of go about it, the reality of the situation is, as was mentioned earlier on, that the voiceover performance or the motion capture performance is just one part of this massive process that needs to take place. So quite often, developers or publishers will try to get 3 voices within the 4 hours. I would just, you know, it's just what needs, like, we are creating hundreds, thousands of characters, and we need to be able to have, you know, characters that can react in a number of different ways. So that's the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation, on the other hand, is that the guys that you're working with, you might have somebody that just comes with the script right there. They don't even know what it is. You know, they might be dealing with a company that's outside of the country, and so there's translation issues and stuff like that. So it's definitely up and down, and more. And then the last thing is, recognize the role that you have. If you've been cast to do three characters, which is going to be, you know, fat cop and, like, you know, cowboy and something else, know that that's kind of what you're prepped for. If it's something of a larger role, no different than in terms of film, they're going to be, you know, they're going to cuddle you a little bit more and kind of like walk you through the process and hopefully provide you with images of the characters and so forth. So that's really kind of the areas of it. And yeah, it's as I said, it's usually, aside from being in a VO booth, nowadays a lot of it's actually being done on the floor. So what is kind of changing is, as we're able to kind of capture people's face and body, we're now, as developers and publishers, trying to make a stronger commitment to the talent by saying, look, we want you to be the look, the body, and the voice. And I'm talking about just the kind of the AAA console stuff. So, you know, we're going into the volume now. We're getting you fully mic'd up. You've got the whole suit on. So, and then after that, there's ADR sessions that you'll have to do to kind of match it up, and certainly pickup sessions, because even if you are playing, you know, Nathan Drake from Uncharted, you are still, you know, got to do your, like, ooh, ah, stuff like that. So that's just the nature of kind of what it is.
Okay, so I think this segues pretty cleanly into a lot of the, I've just been looking through the questions we have from the audience here, and a lot of them are about, questions about the acting aspect of this. So I'll just start with, we'll just go through these, and I think that so there may be some jumping back and forth between topics, because most of them are about acting, some of them are not, so I'll just, rather than try to organize all of them. Here's a very practical one. Which agencies should a voice actor approach? And it says, it has 2 bullet points, the type and specifics.
Such a dangerous question.
So, but you know, just like, I would like to get some voice acting work. I'm sitting in my house.
For games, yeah.
Yes, for games. What do I do?
Agency-wise, my God, okay. I know things. I'm scared to say them.
I'm not. Don Buckwald and
I was gonna say
Associates,
Buckwald.
Abrams. There's a lot of good, actually, agencies here. I mean, I'm missing out a whole bunch of them. I'm just trying to think. I mean,
I'm with Innovative.
You know, Innovative. Like there's, you know, basically there is the voice groups that are kind of known out there. If you're somebody who's trying to break into, like, getting on with an agent, what I've actually suggested to friends of mine who are actors is that they actually check out some games, maybe pick out a cinematic that they like, throw down a couple of barks, look for online for PDFs of, like, these one-liners, and just go in for an hour and just record it. And you know what? It's use stuff that you know people are going to already have heard, and then that's what's going to hopefully try to get you into the door with the VO stuff. When it comes to voiceover performances that I've had much success with are already coming from doing voiceovers in the commercial world and in other areas. Now, not necessarily the guys that are doing the big, like, this is Showtime or this is HBO, like that kind of a thing, but people who are doing a number of radio commercials and so forth. You know, whatever you're doing to try to kind of direct yourself in towards that, gaming is just now an additional way to find your self-employment.
I think right now, I'm not really aware of too many people who are video game specific agents. You'll have people within an agency, and they're usually handling something else, commercials or some other thing, and then video games are also part of their purview. I think one thing that's cool is to look for agents who happen to also like games, which isn't also true a lot. So that's something to that's something to consider. That
Right.
it's not the full. It doesn't have the games don't have the full attention of that individual probably, but that there are people out there who do love games also and will do right by them and by you.
Another thing that I feel people don't really think of is if there are like voice actors out there that you admire, and if you've done enough, like if you have a reel and if you're ready to go agent shopping, get an IMDb Pro subscription. It's like $12 a month or something. You can look up anyone and find their contact information. So maybe look at those actors that you like and see who represents them and see who's around.
Even easier, VoiceBank is free.
Yeah.
You don't need VoiceBank. Everyone who is represented by an agent is listed with their demos, even, and which is also an educational experience, on VoiceBank and who represents them. Sutton Barth and Venari out in LA happens to have, just as a fangirl of video game voice actors, has an unusually high proportion of voice actors that I admire, so I would guess that they're doing something right as well. But LA is sort of a different, I don't understand the sort of landscape there as well.
You have to drive.
I know, but you get to warm up in your car?
It's already warm.
Trade-off.
Okay, so here's another question. For VO and games, is it just a small pool of actors, or is the demand growing for more people to break in? Because there are a few voices that you hear a lot, so it seems like an interesting thing to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate. I find that, you know, being in New York, it's a little bit different. Los Angeles, if you check out the IMDb credits of some of the people that have worked on, you know, certain big publishers' game, it's kind of scary how they're using the same folks. That's one thing that I actually very much take pride in being in New York, because of the roster of talent that we do have that actually can have to survive by taking on a number of different jobs. And so we have a much greater variety. Every game that I've worked on, except for maybe one or two actors, has always been massively different. So you know, unfortunately, part of the industry definitely has tended to go to with the people that they kind of know and they kind of, you know, go back to. I don't think that it's impossible to kind of break into it. I also feel like our earlier conversation that we were having about how the content is changing very much is actually allowing people with different voices, with different backgrounds, and not necessarily the classic, I guess, gaming voice required anymore. So the train is changing, and hopefully that's going to push people in different
What
directions.
is the classic gaming voice?
The classic gaming voice is pretty much what you think a 34-year-old bald white man sounds like, with a deep voice. It's kind of like somewhere between Bruce Willis and and Jean-Luc Picard. All right, like that's kind of where it is. It makes you feel warm and cuddly, but you also can kind of go out and kick ass.
I think the fact that you see, to give people credit as opposed to just calling people who are casting these people lazy, the same people over and over again, I think that it speaks to the specialization, the high level of specialization that voiceover acting or game voiceover acting can represent, that people feel like they will save time and money and get a reliably good performance out of the same people that they've worked with before. So things that are foreign to people like Barks, or people who come in and don't know what games are, I think that reinforces some of the same old casting decisions, that it's a small group of people who, for whatever reason, playing games or not, get what's expected of them.
And I mean, I would also say if you're working with, in any sort of voiceover work, be it for animation, be it for commercial, whatever, look into who's doing the recording, because oftentimes that same studio will also maybe be doing video games, and you can talk to a sound designer who you might be familiar with and say, do you have any game work? You know, I'm doing this small thing, but I'm interested in something else. Can you put me in your Rolodex, call me for an audition? And a lot of times, like, I know we've gotten a lot of the talent from our games through animation, through commercial, through theater even, just people who knew some of the designers that were able to then come in and audition. So mind your social connections. Like, don't be afraid to ask people for stuff, because that's the only way you'll get it.
The games I've done have been through my personal networking.
And you know, very, very simple, right on the nose. Tell your agent. Tell your agent, I want to do games. I mean, it sounds really simple and stupid, but it's amazing how many people that I've talked to, which was like, I really wanted to just do voices. I really want to do voices for games, aside from everything else. And I just really pushed my agent, and that's what got them the audition, and they kind of, took it from there. So I don't think it's something that you naturally kind of think of, which is like, oh, I want to do voice for games. We're much more familiar with the natural paths or the regular paths. So definitely kind of just push it to your agent.
I feel like we may have actually already answered this one, but somebody asked, is there an age prejudice in casting actors for video games?
I mean, again, I have to answer as a player of games. I do not often hear actual, people who voice old characters do almost never sound like they are actually over 40. I'll just say that. So if there's certainly perceived prejudice, I think. I really wish they would work on that.
Yeah, that may come back to the getting three for your thing. If you have the bulk of characters aren't old, then then you're like going to fill someone in from that age pool. I don't know.
I did cast a 92-year-old man, and then his brother was a 28-year-old man, and they were both playing like old heavy metal guys who were in their 70s. So the young guy was really, really, really good. He that's all he did was just multiple different kind of voices. And then the older gentleman, which for me was just a thrill to kind of, it was pretty amazing to work with him. And he could barely get himself into the VO booth, but he did, and he knocked it out, and he couldn't hear in one of his ears, and he was just phenomenal. No, it was phenomenal because that was actually for Alan Wake, and he had no idea what the game was and everything like that. But going to what you were saying, and actually going back to what we were talking about, having actors read off of each other, I recorded him first and then put him in the cans for the younger actor to come in, and that just if I'd gone the other way, although I had to go the other way as well because he had no idea, they were supposed to be in a heavy metal band and they were kind of humming this one song, and he couldn't get it, so I had to get the other guy to actually pre-record it and get him to hear it so he could kind of go with the rhythm of it. So it goes definitely both ways. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know if there's I don't think there's a prejudice. I think what it is that you're looking at what is the demographics of the main characters. And I think that's what it is. And then the world that kind of builds around it. But I think, people are definitely pushing to try to expand that and kind of have a larger scope of it.
That's a good call to record the 92-year-old first, yeah. I would think,
Okay, so here's another one, more practical stuff. Do I need a video game demo reel, and how do I go about getting one done?
I have not heard of it, again with the non-industry-wide standardization, of a video game reel being a really common thing yet. But I have heard people reference them, so I'm starting to wonder if they're becoming a thing. And they should be a thing, because again, like I was saying before, they're situated in a weird place that's character work that's not animation, so it's not going to be as broad as your animation reel. Oftentimes what I do, and what I think a lot of people do, is they'll listen to both your commercial reel and your character reel and try and triangulate and find something in the middle there that says that you can act with character copy, but you can sound like a normal person. I think, but there's a definite need for it, so I hope that becomes a thing because it's different. It would have barks on it. It would have efforts on there. It would have that kind of character work. So I think that, I don't know. I think that might be changing. I think right now you don't necessarily have to, not for good reasons.
I don't think it hurts. I mean, especially nowadays where you can, if you've got a Mac or whatever, you can just kind of hook it up. I would certainly be impressed if aside from the auditions, if I was interested in someone and I went to listen to their reel, which now through most agencies is online, that there's a part of it that actually has barks and stuff like that, I automatically will assume, all right, this person actually understands this scope of what I'm doing. So I definitely don't think it's industry standard at all. But I think if you've got your other stuff and you can go into a booth, especially most of the agents now have their own booth, you could just go in and riff off 30 minutes, you should be pretty. I mean, it doesn't hurt.
Okay, so
Take the initiative.
I have a so this the demo reel is very popular in the questions. What is it better to have in the demo reel to showcase your own voice for video games, your own voice for video games, or character voices?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of the same question. I mean, I think if you want to have some character voices in there, there are still, Disney puts out video games that require very character-y sounding voices. But again, coming back to that, I think most video games demand a much more naturalistic read. So something you probably, and I know people who have, I was just listening to this webinar with someone who's a very experienced character performer, and they probably have hundreds of different wacky characters inside them, and they felt very strongly that they could only get maybe 3 different sounding voices that weren't crazy in a session anyway, that's really the cap. So, so yeah, different kinds of things that are in your wheelhouse. I would say your commercial, whatever you feel like your commercial range is, because nowadays commercials are so natural, then that should be on there.
If you can do like accents though, because that's where you have actors playing the same character, like you know, if you have like an English character and a Russian character and like a dude from California all in the same game and you have a limited voiceover budget, if somebody can convincingly do a bunch of different accents, you know, it's important, and it's been really helpful in sessions that I've run.
That's true. There's always a danger of having like a handful of accents on a reel and then people not knowing that you can do other accents, or like that's what they can do, that's not what I'm looking for.
Right.
But maybe that's not, more producers are more generous than I am giving them credit for.
I think it depends. I mean, what's nice about working where I do is I get a say, and like I don't get the final say in casting, but I certainly like hear the samples and you get to say like, oh well, this person, you know, it's not exactly right, but I think if we just gently directed them, we could really hit it. And so because I think people who've worked with actors before tend to see different things in people than perhaps your game producer who might not have worked with an actor before. So it's very helpful if you can have somebody with familiarity with actors hearing the samples, which doesn't help any of you at all because you don't know who works at the game company.
Okay, so another practical one about recording. How do you best maintain your voice and focus during the long, exhaustive recording sessions for games?
I never had such an energy problem as far as focus in any session I think loses not when you're working, but when you have to stop working for a minute. If like there's a discussion going on that doesn't have to do with you, then you're sort of there trying to hold all the energy in the character that you've got going, and it's just not, because voiceover sessions are so focused on, it's just your performance the whole way through. So it has, but there are those times that are more like a film set where you're just waiting for everything to come together, where that kind of focus becomes necessary. I mean, water, a lot of water. If hot water, if it's there, for preserving your voice.
Yeah.
I think I'm still learning how to preserve my voice through efforts at the end of things, because you want to damage your voice because it sounds real and terrible. That's your instinct, and you can't always do that. So training your voice to maybe put it more in your nose if you can, things like that, to try and help keep things just without shredding your vocal cords for the sake of a really dramatic sounding death. But I mean, yeah, so that's a balance. That's something to figure out. When do you want to go ahead and give it all of that raw sound, and when do you think you can find a way to put it somewhere else that doesn't hurt so bad?
Mm. Yeah, water and rest.
Yeah.
A lot of rest. Be amazed what it does for you.
On the Lord of the Rings DVD, Andy Serkis has a recipe for Gollum juice. And it's some crazy thing he came up with that is like, I don't know, honey and a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, okay, so here's a controversial one. It is, okay, so this is from the audience. There's been some controversy around royalty rates and how much an actor can define, and how much an actor can define the gaming experience. I think this means like, you know, in terms of royalties, like how much is the actor perceived as being, you know, contributing to the reason that people are buying the game? And what are your views on how much credit the voice actor is due in terms of a game's identity?
Well, the easy answer is that it totally varies. Again, I mean, some of the games we've talked about, the actor's performance is absolutely crucial. And other times, it's just not. And that is something that's unlike other media, where it's much more consistent. In film, you're on camera, you're a huge part of the experience, kind of no matter what. And with games, it just totally varies. So I think, if anything, contracts or agreements that are sensitive to that and are sort of customized. I mean, I don't want to tell anyone how to do their contract making business, but I think that's the big thing, is that it's not as set. It's just not as set as with other media. So that's something to be thinking about.
It's not going to happen. And I'll just be going back to what I said at the beginning. You've got hundreds of people. You've got people who are actually animating and creating these characters that you get to voice. It's not the same as TV. It's not the same as film, where we get to capture you, where you should actually be compensated for that, where that film will not change from the moment it starts to the end. That's just, and you are in that movie for whether it's 30 seconds or whether it's 30 minutes. It's you that's being captured in there. The spirit of your voice is being captured in the game, but everything in there has to be created from scratch. And the residuals, or everything that we're talking about, doesn't exist for everybody else that's been working on that game from 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, and the network that it needs to actually be able to get that game to market. So I'm not, I believe that actors are absolutely key and define a game and make a game great. Take a game that could be good and make it great. But when nobody else is actually getting that slice of the cake, it seems kind of unrealistic to be able to give performances who are extremely important to the process. Extremely important, I add. I don't take it lightly. For me, working with actors is absolutely key. It's what makes me do what I do and what I enjoy. But I also am very, very respectful of all the people that are involved in making the games, from your level designers, game designers, sound people, to your animators, to just everybody that it needs to kind of put that together. So it's a different beast, and it can't be compared to the other forms of entertainment, where you are getting captured for everything that you are and rightfully deserve, residuals and so forth.
I want to respond a little bit, because I almost completely agree. But I mean, there have been voice actors that have become very famous, and especially very famous for particular games. I'm sitting next to one of them. Logan, your work is really defines a lot of people's memories of Bastion, and you'll hear this over and over and over and over again. So I mean, again, I think this falls again back to your great advice, which is play games, understand that industry and that scene, because there's a difference between a game that is primarily multiplayer, where no one is ever going to you're going to be doing mostly barks and efforts, or whatever jargon, right? And you are the tiniest percentile of a person's experience. And then there are smaller games which are now exploring more voice work and more interesting sound design, and you have a chance to be a bigger part of that. Of that process, and then there's the perfect moments where you can get in. I think the most famous voice actors are the ones who have become identified with franchises. So games like Uncharted, the voice actor for a game series called Metal Gear Solid is very famous for that role, and he's very well known, more well known than a lot of voice actors.
Vocal about royalties as well.
Yes, yeah, and so. Again, liking games, but all of those people, a lot of those people, that's because they liked this game. They understood what it was, and they got invested in this franchise. But also, someone like Logan, clearly, you invested in this game yourself. You were interested in the process and then in the scene it was operating in. And that is, I think, a big part of why you were such a big part of that game. I mean, once again, it's hard, again, because the money and the fame might be at different ends, right? The most consistent, best work is going to probably be the work that it's hardest to become very, very well known at. But if what you're more concerned with is just sort of having someone say, oh, you are a video game voice actor, I recognize your voice, I care about your performance, then doing more work sort of in smaller games where you can have a bigger impact on how someone experiences that might be a way to go.
Yeah, I think that just seems the biggest difficulty is that difference in culture and payment structure, and it engenders the contractor, because you are a contractor, and that's how you're, and that the treatment that comes with that. But there's this really tricky, horrible tension between a salaried company with employees and a culture of crunching, which, if you don't know, is working really, really hard beyond the normal hours of a week, and then having someone come in for a few hours at a time and be like, yeah, so keep paying me more after I go. But whereas on the flip side of that, the reality of a voice actor is the struggle of booking enough, and having guaranteed payment compared with a salary. So those seem like very, very difficult. That's a really hard chimera to kind of make into a unified payment structure. So I don't know. I hope that we all work it out.
To your point, as I wanted to kind of reiterate, the importance of the performance is key, and when performance like yours kind of elevates it to a certain level, you're not really a voice performer. You are part of the creative team, and for example, I work with a great voiceover actor named Matthew Pratt, and Matthew was the voice for Alan Wake, and there was a definite commitment that went beyond some of our secondary characters, like the old guys who were in the rock band, who did wind up having to do 3 voices. The commitment to him, because he was such an identity, such a voice for it, was greater on behalf of the publisher. So there wasn't a matter of nickel and diming him. It was a matter of like, look, we want you to be a part of it. But I would say, going back to it, overall, my point was that overall, the general number of slots that exist out there for voiceover actors tend to come from these big games that are making massive worlds. And so you have a much, to your point, you have a much less of an impact but a greater financial reward, whereas with some other stuff, and as the industry, as we said, alluded to, is changing, there's a greater possibility of the developer or the publisher being able to actually work with you more as a creative partner and bring you on board in that way.
Okay, so if you feel, I feel like maybe you've answered this one, but what qualities do you look for in a voiceover actor, and what does the casting process look like for you?
I guess for me, it's just about who best fits the character. Because generally, what we've done with our auditions is we write up some sample lines that pertain to the game that we're recording. So we actually have the actors reading for the characters, and we'll get 8 to a dozen different samples that we can listen to them. And it can be about how energetic someone's voice is. If it's a little race car game, whether or not you can picture like listening to that voice like 50, 60 times, it says like, oh, you're in first place now. So I guess different games have different demands, but I think the actors I've enjoyed working with the most, it seems like they've approached the audition, even for something little, with a sense of excitement, and they do it a few different ways. They give it their all, and they show you that they're versatile, and they seem eager to work with you, and I think that's just fantastic. That's sort of what I look for when trying to choose who I want to work with.
I think, and this is, I shouldn't even answer this question because I wasn't cast, but I think that a couple of the things that I find to be more important as compared qualities that I strive for as opposed to other types of jobs is, and I'm having a really rich imagination, because again, you're dealing with so many other unknown variables compared with other things, making your own scene partners in your head, all that kind of stuff. So being confident and flexible and willing to fill in those blanks and make bold, confident decisions on the fly is really important. And a willingness to play and unself-consciousness. I mean, you're going to be stabbed 5 times and you've never done that before, so just go ahead and give an idea of what you think that would sound like. Those, I think, are some sort of special qualities that good game voice actors maybe have.
I think your point is great. I really do think it's about the excitement that you bring to the role, how you know about it. But I also feel that it's about a confidence within your own voice. If you know the strength and the sweet spot of where your voice is, you're going to be able to go in. And look, you might not necessarily get that role, but when you get that role based on where the sweet spot of your voice is and how high and how low you can go, know that not only are you going to be able to nail it, but even in a situation where it's easy to get distracted when suddenly the other side goes really, really, really silent, or, you know, for example, they need you to just, you know, rip through these last 3 lines because they've only got 10 more minutes in the studio and they got to upload this stuff up onto an FTP site to get to who and whatever. Like, if you just, you know, it's like everything else. It's like an instrument. Just if it's practiced and you know the strength of where you're at, then you're going to be able to actually nail that in the audition, and you're going to get that role. Now, that role you might not be right for that role because of where your strength of your voice is, but if you try to pretend to do something up here, you might be able to pull it off for 3 or 4 lines, but you're not going to pull it off for an hour and a half in that VO booth. So just know that confidence of where your voice is, where your strength is. Bring that into that. That's over here. And then just work on the performance. Look on where you're going to line up that script, where you're going to give yourself pauses, where you're going to give yourself breaks, where you're going to take it up, where you're going to bring it down. And let that kind of dictate what that role is, not the sweet spot of your voice. That should be the strength of where it exists already.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And on that point, you know, we've listened for actors where they weren't right for the role they were trying out for, but they sounded perfect for, you know, a role they probably hadn't even considered that they ended up getting hired for just because it was very clear that they knew their voice and what it could do. And while it wasn't necessarily what they had auditioned for at the time, they still got employed. So, you know, just be yourself.
And that's something to remember also. I think that's true, I think for other people, I hope for other people, is that characters can sound really different when they yell. So if you come with a clear idea of a character, like you might want to play with some ideas about what that sound. If I've developed something that's really down here, like what is that going to sound like when I'm screaming on a battlefield and it's going to go up in my range? Like how is that going to stay consistent? So these are some of the other pitfalls when you're trying to like know what your wheelhouse is and what this character is to you in your head.
Okay, so the last question I have is phrased kind of ambiguously, but I think that could be interesting. Do you see yourself doing any more physical work for video games in the future since the technology is becoming more interactive? I'm not sure if this refers to like performance capture, or if this refers to like motion, capturing the player's motion, like with technologies like the Kinect and these other things, or maybe both.
I actually think we're going to see more of it, but the terrain of games is changing right now, so I feel that it's not going to be necessarily a massive explosion. What you are, that market, that niche market of performance are these very high caliber, like blockbuster kind of games, and they are going to exist, and they're going to keep on doing well. I think where we're seeing growth is more from the smaller, the more mobile game, the more indie kind of game area, and I think you're going to see. That's not going to, it's too expensive, to be very, very, very blunt. I mean, you just can't kind of, when you're making a game for 200, 300, 400, 500,000 bucks, let's say, it's really hard to justify doing motion capture or full body performance. So it's really just an economic question. If the game has the ability to, and is well known on the market and has the bandwidth to really, really be able to sell itself, you're definitely going to just see a larger and larger increase in that. But like everything else, it's somewhat based on technology. Most motion capture volumes have a limitation of how many characters you could have in there at one time, and then face performance and so forth just adds more complications. So it's gonna grow. It's just natural for it to grow. We're about to dawn onto something we haven't addressed on the console world. Is we're about to jump into the next gen consoles, and that's going to be a very, very, very interesting kind of time to come about. The PS2 to PS3 and Xbox into Xbox 3 was a very, very natural kind of jump. Now I think we're going to see a little bit of a more drawn out kind of a jump to that. So it's an interesting and a changing environment. I think you're going to see that. I don't think it's necessarily going to explode or define it. I do feel though that the core of what we're here for, which is more than anything else, voice performance is. I think that's just going to grow as natural as the number of titles continue to grow across all the platforms.
I can talk about my feelings about it as opposed to a prediction.
Feelings are okay.
You don't have to, though. I hope so, on the one hand. The one hand is that I really hope to do performance capture, because anytime you have a holistic performance that's not, divorced in various and cut up into different pieces, I think it's generally better. On average, it's better. Having scene partners is a dream and wonderful and lovely. I think that as an actor, having that kind of attention and investment in all elements of my performance is flattering and exciting and wonderful. So I look forward to doing more performance capture for those reasons. I also really like the freedom in casting and castability that comes with not having facial capture, things like that. Being cast for parts that I don't look right for is a joy and unique to voiceover, and really fun and wonderful. I love the experience of recruiting all kinds of parts of my body and my face to get a sound, and that sort of being unselfconscious enough to look like an idiot to turn in a really great performance is also a special joy. So like I kind of I'm of two very different minds about it, but I think it is as a trend. I think it's for the people who can afford it and for the types of games that can accommodate that process. I think there's going to be more of that.
Okay, so we started a little bit late, so I don't know if we're planning on going slightly over 9 o'clock, but we're basically wrapping up. Is there anything else that anybody wants to say? Anything that they were afraid to say?
I'm going to try to make games less and less physically present as I can. I'm starting now, in fact. I'm going to leave and not be physically present here. So.
Okay.
It's hard to top that one.
Spike the mic right there.
Okay. I think, well, it looks like that's it then. So thank you, everybody, for staying here.
Thank you. Thanks very much.